When we think of empires falling, we picture epic battles, cannons roaring, and armies on the march. But what if I told you one of the world's greatest empires wasn't conquered by soldiers, but by accountants? That it wasn't brought down by gunpowder and steel, but by the silent, relentless force of compound interest. This is the incredible, tragic story of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, this superpower was the terror of Europe, its armies reaching the very gates of Vienna. Yet, in the 19th century, it found itself caught in a new kind of warfare, a financial one waged by the banks of London and Paris. It all began with a seemingly simple solution to modernization. Borrowing money, the Ottoman Sultan needed funds to build railways, modernize his army, and keep up with the West.
When you look at history at how nations perish, you usually see the thunder of cannon fire or the march of boots or the screaming of shells. But in the 19th century, something entirely different happened. The greatest empire of the Middle East was destroyed not by soldiers, but by accountants. It was conquered not with gunpowder, blood and smoke, but with quietly operating compound interest. What we are about to tell you is the story of how the first true debt trap in modern history was created and ruthlessly implemented. This is the tragedy of how the Ottoman Empire, a superpower that had terrified Europe for centuries and reached its very gates, was slowly strangled by the banks of London and Paris. This cautionary tale still echoes loudly in our modern world, revealing a brutal geopolitical truth. You don't necessarily need to invade a country to own it. Simply holding its mortgage is enough. To fully understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to take a close look at the Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century. To an outside observer, the empire still appeared to be a formidable giant. Its territories stretched from the Balkans in Europe to the rugged mountains of Anatolia, down to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina below, and across the vast deserts of North Africa. The Sultan in Istanbul ruled over millions of subjects and sat upon a throne commanding the world's most strategic crossroads. But just beneath the surface of this magnificent imperial splendor, the foundation had begun to rot seriously. The empire was economically sick. While Britain and France were rapidly undergoing the Industrial Revolution, building steam engines, factories, and railways, the Ottoman economy had unfortunately remained frozen in its medieval agricultural past. This was a land of peasants and traditional craftsmen trying to compete in an age of machines. The Sultan's treasuries were chronically short of cash. The tax system was both archaic and extremely inefficient, relying on corrupt local officials who easily stole half the revenue before it ever reached the capital. For centuries, the Ottomans had solved their cash flow problems by debasing their currency or confiscating the wealth of rich officials. But in the modern age, these medieval tricks no longer work. The empire urgently needed capital to survive. It needed to build a modern army to effectively defend itself against the predatory Russian Empire to the north. It needed to build roads and telegraphs to strengthen its infrastructure. In short, it needed to look and act like a modern European power. For a long time, the sultans had resolutely resisted the temptation to borrow money from the West. There was a deep cultural and religious aversion to usury, and the fear of becoming dependent on Europe's Christian powers was also very strong. But in 1853, that year the dam finally broke. The Russian Empire invaded Ottoman territory, thereby igniting the Crimean War. This was a large-scale conflict that the Ottomans could never afford to fight alone. Terrified of Russian expansion, Britain and France intervened to help the Turks for strategic reasons. They sent armies and powerful fleets to the Black Sea, but notice they also sent bankers. The war was costing the Ottoman treasury millions of gold liras it didn't have. Soldiers' salaries needed to be paid regularly, cannons needed to be cast, and ships needed to be provisioned. Sultan Abdulmecid was utterly desperate. His advisors told him clearly that he had no other option left. To save the empire, he had to break the ancient taboo. He had to borrow money now. In 1854, a historic step was taken. The Ottoman Empire signed its first foreign loan agreement with a syndicate of British and French bankers. This agreement was presented as a gesture of solidarity from allies fighting a common enemy, a lifeline. But in reality, this was the first link in the golden handcuffs. The terms of the loan were extremely predatory. The bankers knew very well that the Ottomans were a serious credit risk, so they demanded a steep price. The price was set at 8, which meant in practice that for every 100 liras of debt the Sultan signed for, He only received 80 liras in cash. The bank pocketed the difference as a commission and risk premium. But note, the empire had to pay interest on the full 100 liras. This was truly the original sin of Ottoman finance. They were borrowing money at a punishingly high effective interest rate while receiving far less cash. But the cash that arrived in Istanbul felt like a miracle to everyone at first. Suddenly, the army could finally be paid. The crisis was thought to be averted. The Russians were eventually defeated, and the Sultan experienced a deep sense of relief and power. He had discovered almost a magic trick. He realized that with a simple signature on a piece of paper in London, he could summon fleets of gold to his doorstep. The war ended in 1856. But the borrowing never ended. The Sultan and the Ottoman elite had tasted the forbidden fruit of easy credit once and became instantly addicted. They looked at the shining capitals of London and Paris with their romantically gaslit boulevards and magnificent marble opera houses and felt a deep sense of inferiority within them. They now wanted Istanbul to look like a modern European capital too. They wanted to prove to the world that they were not the sick man of Europe, but a civilized and wealthy power. So they began spending big money, but unfortunately they didn't spend the borrowed money on factories, irrigation systems, education, or things that would generate a return on investment in the long run. They spent it on prestige, on spectacle. They spent these funds on the ultimate symbol of imperial vanity, and that was Dolmabahce Palace. Sultan Abdulaziz decided that the old Topkapı Palace, the 400-year-old home of his ancestors, was too old-fashioned. It looked too Asian to him. He wanted a palace to rival Versailles. He wanted a palace that would make even Queen Victoria jealous in his mind. So he ordered the construction of a massive edifice on the magnificent shores of the Bosphorus. Dolmabahce Palace is a building that truly displays staggering opulence. Its interior is filled with a full 14 tons of gold leaf. It contains the world's largest crystal chandelier, a gift from the British Queen. The staircases are made of Baccarat crystal. The carpets are of the finest silk. The walls are carefully lined with Italian marble. It is a truly breathtakingly beautiful building, but it is also in fact a tragic tombstone. It was built entirely with borrowed money. While the peasants of Anatolia were barely scraping a living from the dry earth using wooden plows, the Sultan was importing expensive crystal from Bohemia and gold from France to lavishly decorate a house he could not afford. The total cost of the palace was 5 million Ottoman gold liras, a figure equivalent to exactly 1/4 of the empire's total annual tax revenue. To pay for this, the Sultan went back to the bankers in 1855, then again in 1858, then yet again in 1860. Each time, the bankers in London and Paris happily continued to lend. They were making a huge fortune from the commissions and high interest rates after all. They knew the empire was struggling seriously, of course, but they assumed that Britain and France would never let the Ottomans fail because they were so strategically important geographically. This is the classic concept of moral hazard right here. The bankers took risks comfortably because they firmly believed that governments would ultimately bail them out. By the 1860s, the Ottoman financial situation had now turned into a classic Ponzi scheme. The empire wasn't generating enough tax revenue to pay the interest on the old loans, so it was constantly forced to take out new loans just to pay the interest on the previous ones. They were literally digging one hole to fill another. Debt payments began to rapidly consume the entire budget. In 1860, the empire was spending perhaps 15% of its revenue on debt. By 1870, this number had already dramatically risen above 50%. Just think about the horrifying implications of this figure. Of every dollar collected from a fisherman in Greece or a farmer in Syria, 50 cents was instantly leaving the country to pay a coupon to a bondholder in London. This meant there was no money left for the army, no money left for the navy, no money left for schools, and no money left for infrastructure. The state was being hollowed out from within step by step. To keep the system going, the government was forced to turn to a group of local financiers known as the Galata bankers. These were mostly Greek and Armenian families living in the Galata district of Istanbul. They acted as modern loan sharks to the government when the treasury completely dried up before the next big European loan arrived. The Grand Vizier would go to the Galata bankers and borrow money at usurious short-term rates of 18% or 20% or even higher. This was financial suicide. The Sultan during this period was Abdulaziz, who had succeeded his brother. Abdulaziz was a man with a massive ego and a passionate love for military hardware. He didn't just build palaces, he also built a navy. He looked admiringly at the British Royal Navy and decided he absolutely must have one too. He ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards. He purchased the latest technology Krupp cannons from Germany. For a brief period, the Ottoman Navy was the third largest in the world on paper, but unfortunately this was a fleet that the empire couldn't fuel or properly maintain. The ships sat rusting in the Golden Horn because there wasn't even coal. They were merely floating piles of debt. The real turning point came in 1873. A financial panic began in Vienna and rapidly spread across the entire world, causing a depression known as the Long Depression. Global capital suddenly dried up. European banks, facing their own serious liquidity crises, completely stopped lending. The music stopped now. At the exact same time, nature turned ruthlessly against the Ottomans too. A catastrophic drought struck the heart of Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. The crops failed. Sheep died en masse. The peasants, who were the empire's tax base, faced starvation. Famine stalked the land. Tax collectors went to the villages demanding payment and found nothing but dust and corpses. The revenue stream collapsed, but the debt payments remained fixed, unchanged. In the summer of 1875, Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha looked long and hard at the ledgers and realized the game was finally up. The treasury was completely empty. There was a massive payment due to the European bondholders in October, and there was no cash whatsoever to pay it. He tried to float a new loan, but the markets were closed. No one would lend the sick man even a penny anymore. The empire faced a difficult choice. Either it could starve its own people to death to pay the foreign bankers, or it could stop paying. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued a decree that shook the financial pillars of Europe. It went down in history as the Decree of Ramazan. In this document, the government officially announced that it would cut its debt payments in half. It would pay 50% in cash and the other 50% in paper notes, promising a 5% return. In the polite language of diplomacy, this was a moratorium. In the brutal language of finance, it was a default. The Ottoman Empire had officially gone bankrupt. The reaction in Europe was filled with fury. Millions of middle-class investors in Britain and France had bought Ottoman bonds because they offered high yields. Vicars in England and shopkeepers in Paris saw their savings completely wiped out overnight. The newspapers screamed in huge headlines that the Turks were thieves and swindlers. The diplomatic support that Britain and France had given the Ottomans against Russia instantly evaporated. This financial weakness immediately invited aggression. Seeing that the Sultan was broke and friendless, the Russian Empire saw a perfect opportunity to finish the job they had started in Crimea. In 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 was a complete disaster for the Ottomans. The Ottoman army fought bravely, but they were unpaid, undersupplied, and utterly demoralized. The Russians advanced all the way to the suburbs of Istanbul. They could see the minarets of the Hagia Sophia. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, ceding vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus. But the most devastating clause of the peace treaty was the financial one. The Russians imposed a massive war indemnity. They demanded that the Ottomans pay them over 800 million francs as punishment for the war. Now the Ottoman Empire was in a truly impossible position. It owed hundreds of millions of pounds to British and French bankers on which it had already defaulted, and on top of that, it now owed a massive war debt to the Russian Tsar. The total debt burden was now far greater than the value of the entire Ottoman economy. The empire had completely gone bankrupt. It was defenseless. It had lost its credit, its territories, and its honor. Sultan Abdulhamid II, who had ascended the throne during this chaos, sat in his palace knowing bitterly that he was the ruler of a corpse waiting for the European powers to carve up his land. But the British and French had a very different idea. They didn't want to conquer the Ottoman Empire in the classical territorial sense. That would be both messy and expensive. It would require armies and administration. They had a much smarter idea. They wanted to conquer it financially. They realized that if they simply seized control of the Ottoman economy, they could extract wealth indefinitely without the hassle of governing the people. In 1881, representatives of the European bondholders came to Istanbul. These weren't generals, they were bankers. They carried briefcases, not swords. They sat down with Ottoman officials and dictated the terms of surrender. They weren't asking for land, they were asking for the cash flow. This negotiation led to the Decree of Muharrem, issued in December 1881. This was the the death certificate of Ottoman independence and the birth certificate of the debt trap. It established an organization unique in the history of imperialism. It was called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, or OPTA for short. This was the mechanism of the soft conquest. The OPTA was not a government agency. It was a corporation run by a board of directors representing the banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. It was headquartered in a massive fortress-like building in Istanbul that loomed over the city, a physical symbol of who was really in charge. The decree handed over the empire's most valuable sources of revenue directly to this foreign corporation. The Sultan acknowledged that he was no longer in a position to collect taxes, so the OPTA would do it for him. The taxes on silk were handed over to the OPTA. The taxes on salt were handed over to the OPTA. The taxes on fishing, the taxes on spirits, the taxes on tobacco, and the stamp duty on all legal documents were legally transferred to the control of European bankers. The OPTA built its own bureaucracy. It hired over 5,000 tax collectors. These men wore uniforms, carried weapons, and answered not to the Sultan, but to the board of directors. They fanned out across every corner of the empire, from the mountains of Macedonia to the coast of Syria. They entered the villages and marketplaces and systematically collected the wealth of the Ottoman people. If a fisherman caught a fish in the Bosphorus, a portion of his profit went to paying a bondholder in London. If a farmer harvested silk cocoons in Bursa, the profit went to a banker in Paris. If a peasant bought a bag of salt for his soup, the tax went to Berlin. It was now a state within a state. The OPTA was incredibly efficient. Unlike the corrupt Ottoman bureaucracy, the OPTA was meticulously run according to modern European accounting standards. They built warehouses. They improved salt mines. They distributed disease-free silk were Meg's two farmers. They actually grew the economy, but they grew it for the benefit of the creditors, not the citizens. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPTA collected roughly 1/3 of the Ottoman Empire's total revenue. Really think about this figure. 1 out of every 3 coins generated by the economy was siphoned off and sent abroad to service the debt. The Ottoman government was left with the scraps. They had to run a massive empire, pay an army, and maintain a court with only 2/3 of their own tax base. This meant that the Ottoman state remained perpetually poor. They couldn't invest in education. They couldn't build their own industries. They couldn't modernize their infrastructure. They were trapped in a cycle of underdevelopment because their surplus capital was being extracted by the debt trap. The Sultan became a puppet in his own house. He reigned, but the OPTA truly ruled. If he wanted to build a school or a road, he had to ask the bankers if there was any money left. Usually there wasn't. But the debt trap didn't just extract money, it extracted sovereignty. It became a tool by which the European powers manipulated Ottoman foreign policy, and this opened the door for a new player to enter the game, who would lead the empire to its final destruction, Germany. While Britain and France were content to just squeeze the Ottomans for cash, Germany saw a strategic opportunity here. German Emperor Wilhelm to visit Istanbul and warmly embraced the Sultan. He told the Ottomans that the British and French were parasites who only wanted to bleed them dry. He claimed that Germany wanted to be a true friend. Germany wanted to build them up. The Germans proposed a massive infrastructure project that would change the map of the world, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. This was a dream of steel connecting the heart of Europe to the oil fields of the Middle East and bypassing the British-controlled Suez Canal to the Persian Gulf. For the Sultan, this was a real lifeline. A railway would allow him to quickly transport troops to suppress rebellions. It would modernize the economy. It would tie him to a powerful military ally. But who would pay for this? The Ottoman treasury was empty, controlled by the OPTA. The Germans said confidently, "Don't worry, we'll lend you the money." And so, a new cycle of debt began. Deutsche Bank became the primary financier of the railway, but the Germans were just as predatory as the British. The railway contracts were extortionate. They included kilometric guarantees, which meant the Ottoman government had to pay the German companies a guaranteed profit for every mile of track, regardless of how much traffic the trains carried. And critically, the contracts gave the German companies the rights to all oil and minerals found within 20 kilometers of the tracks. The Sultan had swapped the British golden handcuffs for German steel chains. By 1910, the Ottoman Empire was effectively a German economic colony. German officers trained the army. German engineers operated the trains. German banks held the new debt. The British and French watched this with great fury. They saw their influence slipping away. They saw Germany gaining a foothold in the strategic Middle East. The sick man's debt was no longer just a financial matter. It was a source of friction pushing Europe toward World War I. By 1914, 1914, the Ottoman leadership, now run by the Young Turk movement, finally realized they were trapped. They were desperate to be free. They knew that as long as the debt existed and the Opta controlled their finances, they were not a free nation. When war broke out in Europe, the Ottomans made a fatal calculation. They joined Germany. They believed that if Germany won the war, they could cancel the debts to Britain and France. They could abolish the Opta. They could regain their financial independence. This was an all-or-nothing gamble. On the day they declared war, one of the first things the Ottoman government did was march resolutely to the Opta headquarters in Istanbul. They expelled the British and French directors. They stopped the payments to London and Paris. For a brief moment, they felt the intoxicating rush of freedom, but the gamble failed. The war was a complete catastrophe. The empire was destroyed, but the debt survived. When the Republic of Turkey was founded by Mustafa Kemal in 1923, after a brutal war of independence, the European powers returned again with their ledgers. At the Treaty of Lausanne, the British and French demanded that the new Turkey pay the debts of the dead empire. They argued that Turkey was the successor state. You inherited the land, they said. You inherit the mortgage. Fought hard, but he knew Turkey needed to be part of the global economy. He couldn't start a new nation as a defaulter, so he agreed to pay. The debt was restructured. The payments were reduced, but the obligation remained. The new Republic of Turkey, impoverished and devastated by war, spent its first 30 years sending millions of dollars abroad to pay for the reckless spending of the sultans from the 1850s. The final payment on the Ottoman debt was made on May 25, 1954. It took exactly 100 years to pay off the mistake. The story of the Ottoman debt trap is the ultimate lesson in the danger of financial dependency. The Ottomans thought they could import modernity. They thought they could by the appearance of being a great power with other people's money. They didn't understand that money is never neutral. Every loan is a tether. Every bond is a chain. The British and French didn't need to conquer Istanbul with soldiers. They didn't need to garrison the cities. They simply waited patiently for compound interest to do the work. They proved that the most effective way to destroy an empire is not to attack it, but to lend it money it can never repay. The sick man of Europe didn't die of old age. He was foreclosed upon, and the lesson he left behind is written in the red ink of the ledger book. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. Sovereignty is about solvency. If you don't own your debt owns you. And this is the Golden Chronicle channel, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among those who saw it coming. So subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve.